Hello and welcome back to the channel, ladies and gentlemen. This is not going to be my usual optics review video, or at least it's not going to follow the same format, because what we're looking at here today has been discontinued for a little bit over a decade. In fact, these were first introduced in 2011. As far as what I'm talking about, if you couldn't tell from the title of this video, we are looking at the Gen 1 Razor HD 1:4 in the first focal plane. If you had no idea that these existed, you're in for a real treat. Because, in my opinion, what you are looking at right here, right now, in my hands, is the genesis scope for most modern day first focal plane LPVOs. And this thing came out 14 years ago. So, grab some popcorn, come on in, let's take a much closer look at this thing and talk about the perplexing design features that Vortex put into this optic. Here it is, ladies and gentlemen. This 1:4 LPVO is in the first focal plane. Now, that's not unusual. There have been plenty of other first focal plane 1:4s, but to my knowledge, this is one of the first. But it really perplexes me when we take a look at the reticle why this thing's even in the first focal plane. Because you'd expect maybe a milling reticle, maybe a BDC of some sort, but instead, what you find inside of this first focal plane 1:4 is a very simple duplex. So why? Why have it in the first focal plane? That's the first sort of head scratcher. Because who in their right mind would do that? No idea. Anyway, as far as the overall layout of this optic, it looks fairly similar. You can see that these are made in Japan, just like all other razors have been since this, which is really cool to see. We are going to just talk about the back real quick before we start moving up forward. The back is a fast focus eyepiece with really nice knurling on it. And even though this thing has been absolutely used and abused, it is absolutely rock solid. The knurling on the back is exceptional, even though it is very, very worn. And I gotta say, I have no real complaints about that. Moving up to the magnification ring, this is a rubber overmold. 1:4 is at 180 degrees. And the knurled, or I should say the molded knurling inside the rubber magnification ring, feels quite nice. There's a good amount of traction on this, but the problem with this is putting a regular standard throw lever on this might cause it to slip. You might have to get something that's going to be a little bit more in tune to locking in to the knurling. It does feel really, really solid though. And before I move forward, I should say this has already been sent off to Vortex to get a checkup, because I had gotten this from a friend of mine who used it at his company to test bench against their optics. I'm not going to get too in the specifics of that, but I paid a little bit over $700 for this thing, which sounds like madness, and it absolutely is. But I had never, ever seen one of these for sale previously. So when it first came to my attention that this would be getting offered soon, I had to buy it. I had to know what it was like. I got it. I did my full, I would say about 95% of my review with it. And I'm just like, optically, this seems like there's something wrong. So I sent it over to Vortex. They received it, and they gave me a full breakdown of this optic within about a week or so. They did find something wrong inside with the parallax lenses, and I'm sorry, the lenses inside were problematic, and they couldn't set the parallax properly. They got it close, they said, but it wasn't 100%. So what they offered to do was do what Vortex is known for with their warranty, replace it with a more modern optic free of charge. Now, they weren't going to give me back the 1:4, but I didn't film the tabletop review. So I really wanted to have this thing back in my hands. So instead of giving me an optic that was semi-fixed and give me a brand new Gen 2 1:6 in exchange, they decided to send this back to me and decommission it. So if we look inside this thing, we can still see the reticle, we can still see the illumination, but when we change the magnification, nothing really happens. Nothing really works. And as a result of that, this is no longer used as an optic. This is just an inanimate object. But that's fine by me, because the optical performance on this thing that when I got it and reviewed it with was subpar. And you'll see that momentarily. So instead of me trying to get this thing back and maybe trying to sell it and maybe making some of my money back, I said, you know what? It really isn't that good of an optic anyway. So at least if I have this back as an inanimate object, I can leave it on my shelf and look at it and admire it every once in a while. Because every time that I've picked this up since I got it, I look at it and go, wow, this is really, really weird. And it's a really cool piece of history to have for me. You can also note that this had been serviced because there is a 1:6 front objective on this thing. They really did try to make this thing as good as possible, but this is as good as they were able to get it. And I really appreciate the guys over at Vortex that I was in communications with, because they were an absolute pleasure. They got this and another scope for me that had an illumination issue. Took care of that, no problems. Took care of this to the best of their abilities. And I got everything back in about 2 weeks, which is frankly fantastic. So yes, this is really rock solid. This is very smooth and easy to turn. And there's a reason for that. This thing had just recently been serviced. So keep that in mind. But with all that being said, let's finish looking at the quirkiness of this thing. The illumination knob is not all that dissimilar from what we'd see on a modern optic, with the exception of the numbers are not facing the correct way when you're looking at this thing from behind. They are facing towards the scope body. Not the end of the world. Action on the detent is actually quite good. It's pretty easy to turn, but it really pops into that detent quite well. I have no real complaints, and it felt the exact same way before I sent it off to Vortex to get checked up. I'm not going to talk about the elevation turret yet. We're going to talk about the windage. This is in quarter MOA, and we do have right and left properly marked. It's non-locking, of course, so having a giant exposed windage turret like this on a 1:4 is, again, quite perplexing. But this is not the first time that we've seen that. Clicks on this are pretty solid. It was a little bit harder to turn when I first sent it in, so I'm sure that they serviced this thing through and through to make it as good as possible for me, and I really do appreciate that. Other than it just being oddly placed on a 1:4 LPVO, the windage turret is quite good. The real interesting part, though, is the elevation turret. As you can see, on the back, we have a bunch of numbers and different colors on the turret. But before we look at it, let's look on top of it. Each click is a quarter MOA, and we have 2 different colors with 2 different cartridges. On top, we have in green M855, which is 62 grain full metal jacket, and underneath that in orange, we have XM193 55 grain full metal jacket. Smart that they chose the green tips to be green and the non-green tips to not be green. Pretty smart. What that means is, despite the fact that this is in the first focal plane with a duplex style reticle, they built in a BDC compensated turret. Now, I don't know what barrel length this is calibrated for, probably 14.5 or 16 inch. I don't know what elevation, but you get the idea. This is just very cool to see being on a 14-year-old scope. And the way that it works is you'd start off at your 100-yard zero with both cartridges, and as you want to dial up, you keep dialing. So as we spin this turret around, you'll see that we're going to come up to the M855 first before the XM193, meaning that the XM193 is going to have more of a drop than the M855. Go to 200 yards, they're only a click off. 300 yards, again, they're only a click off, which is, why even bother at that point? Even 400 yards, they're a click off. 500 is where we start seeing a much larger spread. 600, a much larger spread. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then at 700 yards, we have a vastly larger step. So not only does this scope have a first focal plane duplex reticle, but it's got a really cool BDC built into the elevation turret. Again, who knows if this was calibrated ever, and if it ever lined up on anyone's particular rifle. Unfortunately, I won't be able to test that out anymore, but I don't think it really matters. This as an exercise is, it almost feels like Vortex was flexing when they built this scope. How much can we pack into an optic and release it and sell it and release it to the public? And that's kind of what this feels like. It feels like this was just a test bed to try a first focal plane scope, to try a simple reticle, to try an elevation turret like this. And what this probably spawned was this. the second focal plane 1:6 with fiber dot illumination. This is just about as good of a 1:6 second focal plane LPVO as you could possibly get. And we got this because Vortex built this and learned from their mistakes. Unfortunately for the Gen 3s with the first focal plane 1:10s, they took the simplistic approach of these Gen 2s and really tried to cram all that information and all that technology into another package like this. But instead of having an elevation turret that would be your BDC, you have a very fine Christmas tree style reticle. And, well, frankly, one of the worst setup reticles as far as needing illumination to properly use it at almost every magnification. So they went from this to this to that. The only other thing I could think of to talk about is the weight. And the Gen 1 comes in at 20.3 ounces, which is not very light. But neither is the Gen 2 at 21.8 ounces. Again though, as far as an experience with a second focal plane 1:6, the Gen 2 Razor HDE is just about as good as you could possibly get. But this video is not going to be talking about this optic. It's going to be talking specifically about this one. So let's get behind this thing and let me showcase just how perplexing it really is. Let's take a very close look at this reticle. This is at 1x. This should be in the second focal plane. I will carry that one with me to the grave. It makes no sense other than Vortex really wanted to flex their muscles and focus on building a first focal plane optic and using this as a test bed. That's the only thing that makes sense to me. The illumination on this scope is actually quite good. Given the fact that this thing is as old as it is, I was expecting it to either be really dim or really washed out. As it turns out, the illumination on this is among one of the better ends on the first focal plane spectrum, at least in the LPVO world. As far as how much of the scope body we see, that is as good as you're going to get it. I pull it closer to the camera by 1 pixel, and you can see, going from minimum to maximum, there's no shadow gain or loss. Putting it back to where we were and then 1 pixel farther forward yields that when we increase the magnification to its maximum, we start getting a very heavy shadow. So where we have it for the rest of this video is as good as we're going to possibly get out of this optic. I cannot say for sure that it would be improved if Vortex did what they did and tried to fix it as best as they could, but I'm not going to really hold my breath saying that it would be much better than this, even if it was in tip-top perfect shape. All in all, I don't hate this reticle. The posts at 3, 6, and 9 are very nice and pronounced, very easy to pick up, and the crosshair in the middle, even at 1x, is a pretty good size. At 4x, I think it's still a pretty good size, but it gets a little bit bigger for some of those finer shots, if you could even say that would be a problem. The illumination on this thing, though, is excellent. When I first got this scope, the turrets were really hard to turn, so Vortex definitely did some magic to the turrets to clean them up a good bit. The sound on the turrets are both really good, but there's a little bit of mush and softness when you make an adjustment. I give all of my scopes a rough 0 at my house, in my backyard. I mount up a scope that I know has a perfect 0 for me, and I set this up right alongside of it. And it's worked out extremely well since I started that process, because now for me filming in the garage is quite a challenge. I'm not there all that much, and it does take me sometimes to go down there and get some filming done. It was at this point when I tried to do some sort of tracking test with this optic that I said, I'm just going to send this into Vortex and have them take a look at it. As a result of that, I didn't even bother filming the garage clearing segment with the scope, which In hindsight, I should have still done it, but I was expecting to get the scope back. I guess that was me being woefully optimistic. As far as how this thing tracks, though, it tracks actually pretty straight and true to my target. But you could see I couldn't get the focus any better than what we have it here currently. Now, tracking on a scope like this isn't something that I'm really putting in high priority, but I wanted to see, with how old this thing is and how hard it's been used and abused its entire life, if it could still track. And it tracks quite straight and has very little to no slop to the turrets. And again, this is before I sent it into Vortex. So afterwards, I'd imagine it'd be even better. In my backyard, just showcasing how much of the scope body is visible with this thing is laughable. It's comical. It's hilarious. The posts at 3, 6, and 9 are very visible. That center crosshair with the illumination on full really sort of just disappears. The 1X on this thing wasn't terrible as far as flatness goes and overall 1X-ness. I would say there was a touch of magnification to it, which made it a little bit challenging to use this thing both eyes open. But again, given that this did in fact have a serious issue with the internal components on it, I can't really say much negative about it. At my 81-yard target, though, this is as clear of an image as we were able to muster. And that's when I started realizing, like, hey, you know what? Maybe I should do something about this. But I figured, let me at least give it the good old college try first. And I'm glad that I did, because if I didn't film any of this stuff, I wouldn't have a video to make. So there we go. Illumination is quite good on this thing. And even when you push this thing past its perfect centered eyebox, the illumination is still visible all the way to the point where you can't see out the shadows. But look at how badly the distortion is on the target and on the reticle when we go slightly off center. It actually sharpens up a touch off center, but then it really dramatically falls off. The image stability on this is extremely poor at 4x. And at 2x, it was just about the same. And at 1x, as you'll soon see, it's just about the same. Again, I can't say for certain, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Vortex could in fact improve upon this and repair it most of the way. There was no way for me to really get an idea or a sense of just how messed up this was off of quote-unquote perfect, whether it was 50%, 75%, 25%, or 95%, I can't really say. Neither could Vortex. But even if this was 50% as good as it could possibly be on the best of days, it still wouldn't be as wonderful as most modern scopes, especially in this magnification range. The dynamic eyebox of this thing at 1x is actually quite impressive. You can really get around this thing with very little drama. Get far away from it, choke up on top of it, be off sides of it, and it would still be pretty usable. I mean, granted, the image would distort horribly, but you could still look through it if you had to. Even at 2x, it's not that bad. The problem really comes in at 4x, which is the limiting factor at how far I could really set the eye relief on this thing to make sure that we have the smallest amount of scope body that we can see through the scope while still having the sharpest possible image. And that right there is the reason why we see so much of the scope body, because the 4x in this thing is pretty tight. If I was to compare this to a Steiner P4XI, for example, that would perform much better here. Granted, that is a much more modern optic and in second focal plane, but the fact still remains. The low light performance on this thing, though, did impress me. I was expecting this to really not let in as much light as it does. But to my surprise, and I'm sure yours, it actually wasn't bad at all. Illumination out here is way too bright. And a classic trait of having a first focal plane optic like this is the balancing of the reflection when the illumination is set too bright. Easily enough for this scope, you just dial it down a little bit and it does clear up. But it's still plaguing a lot of modern optics in the first focal plane, especially the 1:8 or 1:10 first focal plane options, because when you set the illumination just a little bit too bright, it reflects back at you and sometimes gives you a nasty ring. You could see it when we go all the way to the extremes here at 1x, that it does still creep up, but it's still not terrible. If I did increase it back to full, you would see what I'm talking about. And you will see something like this on most modern LPVOs like this. But this was an extreme example. Again, I don't know if it's due to the fact that there was damage to the scope or if this was as good as it would possibly get. As good as the light transmission seems on this optic, unfortunately, the sharpness to the image really suffers, and it suffers greatly. It's pretty hard to see what's going on down there, and that's just an unfortunate circumstance of this thing. I'm going to make one last pass of the targets downrange to show off that the 1X on this thing is actually quite good. The amount of scope body that you see is just disheartening. It's insane how much of the scope body you see. You see a lot of the scope body on the Schmidt & Bender 1:8 dual dot that I'll be showcasing soon, but that thing's 1X is so good that you just don't care because that scope is just fantastic. But this scope is an enigma. It's perplexing. It really does make me scratch my head. I'm adamant that this scope was just a tour de force for Vortex. It's like they went up to the engineers and said, go crazy and make something wild. Make something that we could use as a test bed so we could take some knowledge from this and move forward and produce better products. I don't know that for certain, but that's what I really feel is the case. Because we look at the Gen 2 Razor HD 1:6 and see all the improvements that that scope has over this, and it can't be by coincidence. It can't be by happenstance. Then you look at the Gen 3 Razor 1:10 in the first focal plane and see yet again a vast increase in overall capacity and performance. I think a lot of that has to do with the lessons that Vortex learned producing this optic, or at least designing it and having Low, or Light Optics Works of Japan, be the OEM to produce these optics. By Low actually manufacturing them, I'm sure that they learned a lot of manufacturing techniques and workarounds to improve upon some of the defects found in this scope, whether it was by design or just the limitations of the manufacturing process at that given time. And then, of course, from this optic, Low would be able to take that information, that knowledge, that wisdom, and translate it into the next generation of products. This will be very prevalent to you when I do my review of the RDB PLXC 1:8 in first focal plane, because that is the best PLXC that I've gotten my hands on. I've gotten my hands on all of them, and I'm 95% certain that it's because Low, Light Optics Works, had developed the first generation first focal plane PLXC and then the second focal plane PLXC. And the experiences that they had with those optics are translated into this new optic, because everything about the RDB is better than either of the previous PLXCs, whether in the first focal plane or second focal plane. And from a good friend of mine that I trust his judgment on, he got behind the new PLXC 2.5-20, which is also made by Low, which was the same as the NX8 from Night Force. And he says that the Night Force, as great as it is superseded by the new PLXC 2.5-20. Again, because Low learned a lot when they developed the NX8 and has taken that knowledge and put it into the new PLXC. And that is why, folks, that I am calling this the genesis for modern day LPVOs, because I'm pretty confident that a lot of what was learned from this scope being produced by Vortex or the OEMs themselves has trickled down into what we see today on our shelves. With that all being said, ladies and gentlemen, a huge thank you to Vortex for doing their best to repair this thing for me. A huge thank you to my friend for letting me buy it off of him. And a huge thank you for all of you for staying tuned. As always, I'll see you again next time. And a huge thank you to my Patreon providers and my Subscribe Star subscribers. Without you, this truly wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to support my channel but don't want to join either of those, I completely understand. But you could still help by using my affiliate links in the description below, and or like, share, and subscribe as always. Again, thank you very much.